The movie starts with a female teacher, Jo March, entering an editing office. She hands her novel to Mr. Dashwood, the editor-in-chief, and tells him she wants it published. After going through it, he accepts it but tells her it's too long and not a lot of people would read it. He pays her $20 for it. He tells her if she writes a novel with a girl as the main character, she must either be dead or married at the end. Jo returns to her boarding house and writes by the fireplace. Her neighbor Friedrich tries to start a conversation with her, but it's time for her to teach a class. Meanwhile, her sister Amy is in Paris, taking painting classes. She isn't satisfied with her painting. Her Aunt March, picks her up in a carriage. Amy reads a letter from her family. She tells Aunt March that her sister, Beth, is sick. She also says she wants to go and see Beth, but her family wants her to stay in Paris. Aunt March tells Amy there's no need for her to go home, and she should focus on getting engaged to her boyfriend, Fred Vaughn. Amy spots her childhood friend and neighbor, Laurie, and comes down from the carriage to meet him. After exchanging pleasantries, Laurie tells her that Jo turned down his marriage proposal. She apologizes, but Laurie says he's over it. She invites him to an upcoming ball and asks him to pick her up. Her third sister, Meg, is shopping for some clothes. Her friend, Sally, convinces her to buy an expensive piece of fabric. Meg later regrets buying that fabric. Jo and Friedrich watch a play at a theater, and dance at the after-party. The movie goes back to 7 years earlier. Meg and Jo attend a party. Meg joins some friends for a dance while Jo watches. Fred Vaughn invites Jo for a dance, but she turns him down and hides in a secret room. She bumps into Laurie. After introducing themselves, Laurie asks Jo to dance with him. Jo says she can't because she burned her dress. Laurie suggests they dance outside the house. Meg spots them and tells Jo she hurt her ankle. Laurie drops them off and meets the rest of their family. Jo asks him if she can call him Teddy and he says yes. Amy admires him and introduces herself. Laurie greets her back. In the present, Friedrich gives 3 Shakespeare novels to Jo. He tells her they would help her work on her writing, and he's interested in reading her work and giving her feedback. Laurie shows up at the ball half drunk and in the company of 2 women. Amy calls him out for his carefree attitude towards life. She tells him that she feels bad that Jo rejected him, but he should do something meaningful with his life. He criticizes her for wanting to marry Fred Vaughn for his money and leaves the ball. Friedrich reads Jo's novel and tells her he doesn't like it. She gets angry and tells him to stay away from her. Jo receives a letter from her mom telling her of Beth's illness. While heading home on a train, Jo remembers one of her childhood Christmas. She and her sisters talk about how they hate being poor and share their dreams. Meg says she wants to be a rich housewife and have lots of servants. Amy says she wants to be a world-class painter. Jo says she wants to be a famous writer, and Beth says all she wants is just to have the family together. Jo shares a script for a play she has written with her sisters. While she gives them their roles, their mom, Mommy, shows up. After wishing them a Merry Christmas, she begs them to sacrifice their breakfast for a poor family, the Hummels, who live close by. Their daughters accept. Laurie, his grandfather, Mr. Lawrence and his tutor, John are having breakfast. Laurie sees the women going to give out their breakfast. The girls return home to meet a large breakfast on their table. Hannah, their maid, says that Mr. Lawrence sent it to them as a reward for giving out their breakfast. Jo suspects that it was Laurie who convinced his grandfather to do it. Mommy tells the girls that their father sent a letter. In it he says he misses them and that while he's away, they should work hard and be good to their mom. In the present, Friedrich's maid tells him that Jo checked out of the boarding house. Jo remembers a time she and her sisters were walking on the streets. She goes to Aunt March's house while the others head to school. Jo is hired by Aunt March to read novels to her. Aunt March tells Jo to be well behaved if she wants her favors. Jo thanks her for her kind offer but says she prefers to be independent. Aunt March tells her women can't be independent and they should only look to marry rich men. Jo tells Aunt March that she isn't married. Aunt March says she doesn't need a man because she's already rich. She says the only way for a woman to be unmarried is if she's rich, and also tells Jo she shouldn't make the same mistake her mom made by marrying a poor man. She promises to take Jo on her next trip to Europe. At school, Amy's classmates convince her to draw their teacher. Amy gets caught and whipped with a cane. Laurie is in his library with John when he sees Amy crying. He brings her inside the house, treats her wounded hand and calls her family. Meg, Jo and Mommy show up. Amy loves the paintings in his library and Jo is fascinated with the books. Jo sees a painting of Laurie's grandfather and tells him hers was more handsome. Mr. Lawrence overhears her and tells her she talks like her grandfather. Mommy tells Amy she shouldn't go to that school again. Lori tells them they're free to come around whenever they like. Mr. Lawrence asks them to tell Beth to feel free to come and use his piano anytime. In the present, Jo goes to a mailbox on a tree close to Lori's house. While opening it, she remembers the day Lori joined her in her sister's acting club and gave each of them keys to that mailbox. She finds nothing in the box and heads home to meet Mommy, Meg and her 2 kids, Demi and Daisy. Mommy tells Jo that Beth's fever is worse and her heart is weak. Jo provides money for them to get a doctor. She asks if Amy is coming. Meg says that Beth doesn't want Amy to come home till she finishes her trip in Europe. The scene changes to the past again. Jo and Meg go on a movie date with Lori and John. Amy begs them to let her come but they don't allow her. As payback, Amy burns some of Jo's novels. After the date, Jo looks for her novel. Annie tells her she burned it. Jo breaks down in tears and vows to never forgive Amy. The next day, during breakfast, Lori comes and picks Jo for a hangout session. Meg tells Amy to go after them and wait till Jo is in a good mood then apologize. Amy follows Jo and Lori, who are skating on ice, and calls them. Jo ignores her. When Amy enters the ice, it cracks and she falls. Jo and Lori rush to her rescue. Jo apologizes to Amy. Jo tells Mommy that she has an issue. She explains that she enjoys hurting people when she's angry. Mommy tells Jo that she reminds her of herself. She explains that she's angry almost every day but tries so hard not to show it. She advises Jo to work on controlling her temper. In the present, Beth wakes up and meets Jo sitting beside her. Jo hugs her and gives her some water. She tells Beth that she would take her to the sea to help her heal. Jo also says that Amy and Lori are together in Paris. She says Lori hasn't been responding to her letters and she misses him a lot. In the past, Meg heads off to a ball she was invited to. Her mom gives her a necklace to wear to the event. Before the ball starts, the organizer, who's her friend, Annie, tells her to change her gown and gives her a new one. She also says she would refer to Meg as Daisy from now on. Everyone loves Meg's gown and Annie tells her to keep it. Lori shows up at the ball and meets Meg. He tells Meg to stop acting like someone she's not. Meg is upset. She asks Lori if he likes her gown and he bluntly says no. Meg calls him rude and walks away. Lori later apologizes to Meg and asks her to dance with him and she agrees. In the present, Meg is with John, who's her husband. She tells him she bought an expensive fabric and apologizes, saying she was tired of seeing Sally, her friend, buying nice things while she had nothing. She says she's tired of being poor but takes back what she said immediately. John gets upset. He apologizes to her for not giving her a better life and goes to bed. Lori shows up at Amy's painting studio and apologizes to her for what happened during the ball. Amy forgives him and tells him she's quitting painting. Lori tries to encourage her to continue but she doesn't listen. He asks her to paint one last portrait of him. He also asks her what she wants to do after quitting painting. Amy says she'll fall back on her other talents. Lori suspects she's referring to Fred Vaughn. He asks Amy if she would accept if Fred proposes to her, and she says yes. She says it's because Fred is rich. Lori criticizes her for it. She explains that in their society, there is no way a woman can make her own money without getting married. She says she needs to do it to support her family. Fred Vaughn shows up in a carriage and she leaves with him. In the past, Lori introduces Fred Vaughn and his sister Kate to John, Amy and her sisters on a beach. Lori tells Jo that John loves Meg. Jo is angry because she doesn't want anyone to take Meg away from the family. Lori jokes to Jo that someone would come and take her too. In the present, Jo is reading a novel to Beth at the beach. Beth asks her to read one of her works to her instead. In the past, Mommy receives a letter that her husband is very sick. She starts packing to go and see him. Jo gives her money for a train which she raised by selling some of her long hair. After hugging her daughters, Mommy leaves them under the care of Hannah and Mr. Lawrence. Jo later cried secretly about the loss of her hair and Amy comforts her. In the present, Amy is drawing Lori and asks him when he plans on going home. Lori says he wants to stay with her and Fred instead. She asks him to go and work for his grandfather but he refuses. Amy shows Lori 2 portraits she drew of him and he likes them. He asks her when she drew the second one and she says the day she met Fred at the beach. He asks her where Fred is and she says he's on a business trip in London. Lori begs Amy not to marry Fred because he's in love with her. Amy says she won't let him settle for her because he couldn't have Jo. She also admits that she's been in love with Lori her whole life. In the past, Joe reads letters from John which says their dad is getting better. Beth reminds them that their mom asked them to check on the Hummels. Her sisters refuse, so she goes herself. She comes back to meet a piano gifted to her by Mr. Lawrence. Beth goes to his house to thank him. He notices her temperature is rising and he calls the doctor. The doctor tells Mr. Lawrence and Beth's sisters that she has scarlet fever and the Hummels baby just died from it. In the present, Joe reads a short story piece she has just written to Beth. Beth likes it and tells her that she's been thinking about death for a while and she's ready to face it. Joe tells her not to talk like that, but Beth says her death is inevitable. Joe vows to do all she can to stop Beth's death, saying she has stopped it before. In the past, Joe takes care of Beth who's sick. Beth says she's afraid God wants her to die. Joe says she won't die and God is going to spare her life. In the present, Aunt March tells Amy that Laurie has just left and he says he's heading to London. Amy is sad. She tells Aunt March that she just turned down Fred Vaughn's marriage proposal. While Meg and Joe are caring for Beth, John shows up. He tells Meg that she should stay with Beth and he'll take care of the kids. He says that he's also going to give her money to sew her expensive fabric into a beautiful dress. Meg says she already sold the fabric to Sally. John says he doesn't want her to be unhappy, but she says being his wife makes her happy. Meanwhile, Beth has a brief heart attack. Joe stabilizes her and spends the night with her. In the past, Joe wakes up on Christmas morning to find Beth fully recovered. Shortly after, their dad shows up and they eat breakfast. In the present, Joe wakes up the next morning and finds her mom crying over Beth's death. Shortly after, the family holds her funeral. In the past, Meg gets married to John and Aunt March invites Amy instead of Joe to go with her to Europe. Laurie proposes to Joe, but she rejects him, saying they would be unhappy together and she doesn't even want to get married. Laurie tells her she would change her mind someday and he'd be there to see it. In the present, Amy tells Laurie she won't be marrying Fred and they kiss. Mommy tells Joe that Laurie and Amy would be coming soon. Joe admits that she regrets rejecting Laurie's proposal, and although she doesn't love him, she's willing to marry him and get rid of her loneliness. Laurie meets Joe later on and tells her him and Amy are engaged. Joe is shocked but congratulates him. Amy reunites with Joe and Joe congratulates her too. Joe reads Beth's diary and writes a novel based on the life of the four sisters. She takes it to Mr. Dashwood. Mr. Dashwood loves it but asks her to change the ending to make sure the main character, who's a female, gets married. Joe changes the ending with the main character reuniting with her lover. Aunt March dies and leaves her mansion to Joe. Joe plans to turn it into a school for boys and girls. Friedrich comes around later and tells Joe he'd be moving to California soon and he came to tell her goodbye. Her family notices the love between them and after Friedrich leaves, they ask her to chase him and make him stay. Joe follows Friedrich and begs him to stay. Friedrich agrees and they kiss. Laurie and Amy later have a baby. Joe opens her new school where Amy, Meg and Friedrich teach in it. The movie ends with Joe collecting her published novel, titled Little Women, from the printing press. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to watch more videos like this.